Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a very insightful conversation today about a topic that I think has been in the news over the past 24 months. Today, we're going to talk about remote leadership and what that looks like, and what are some of the lessons that we can learn from leaders that have had to lead remotely in the past, and what can we take away, and how can we enable our organizations with regards to that. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Today I'm joined by Darren Barrett, and Darren, really great to have you with us. Welcome to the call.
Thank you, Dieter. Pleasure to be with you.
Darren joined us today, and we've invited him to this conversation because he has been a leader at senior management level for organizations such as The Body Shop, Nike, as well as Peloton, and he's held senior leadership positions where he has been forced to, if I can say that, Darren, due to set up to lead remotely even before the pandemic. And what we would really like to tap into today is some of your lessons that you've learned around what can leaders do to equip themselves in this remote environment. To introduce the topic, I think one of the key things that we've seen over the past 24 months is, on the one side, remote work. We are seeing the benefits thereof. A lot of people are commenting on they've got the opportunity to spend more time with family, the flexibility. On the other side, we're also seeing the challenges that people have around boundaries. We're also seeing the challenges that people have around burnout. I think there's a very interesting debate at the moment around people returning to office environments. There was a very interesting article this morning where a very senior executive at Apple actually resigned because he was forced to go back to the office 3 days a week. And I think we're starting to see a lot more of those types of things in this environment. Darren, get us started. Let's talk about what is leading remote teams. Can you give us a bit of a working definition of, in your view, what that means?
Sure. And, I kind of, growing up in retail and being responsible for what we call a field team. So ultimately the stores in our, in our portfolio, my team have never really been with me. And I think the challenge for me early on when I was sort of learning the ropes, and this is before remote leadership was even a thing.
Yes.
It's kind of become more of a thing with what we've experienced through lockdown. It was never really called out. It was just, your team were not
the way
with
things
you.
were done. Exactly right.
Right. So I think communication was absolutely the biggest challenge. And if you only have to look at the color of my hair, Dieter. I've been around a little while. Right? It was 2003 when I secured a role with Body Shop as a regional manager, and from there it was kind of where I had to figure out how do you lead teams remotely.
Yes.
And this was in the days prior to the wonderful connection that we have now with state-of-the-art meeting rooms and technology. And this was even pre-Zoom, and I can't even think of what came prior to Zoom. I remember Blue Jeans and various other tools. This was a star phone in the middle of a table. And I remember progressing from stores through to leading stores throughout Europe, and having a conversation with 10 people in 10 different countries with 10 different languages, cultures, filters, all of those things we know. And guess what happened at the end of the call? There'd be 10 different versions of what I said.
Oh, I can imagine. And
Right?
Probably 10 different interpretations of what the next steps are and what those things need to be.
Exactly. And I found that really tough at the beginning. It was wasting time for people. It was causing frustration, but really a challenge to overcome. So I kind of came up with this mantra of communicate, check understanding, and follow up.
I like that.
Made a huge difference, Dieter, especially as we all practiced and we all got better. And as long as you do all three of those things, you can communicate the smallest message or the biggest message. Maybe you'd like an example?
I'd love the example. Before we get there, I want to tap into something that you've mentioned. I think there's, beyond just communication, there's also for me an element around, trust and relationship that has to exist. And I think the point that you made was a really valuable one, where I think today we do have a lot of those tools available. I'm able to talk to you in two different countries today, and it's almost just feels like we're in the same room, which I think does help quite a bit. But I do think there is still that element of, and I had a CEO I worked for at some stage that says, if you really want to drive engagement in an organization, people need to get to know each other a little bit better so that they get to like each other a little bit more. And that's something that stayed with me for quite a period of time. So I would love, as part of your example, for you to also talk about, how did you get people just to feel like a team? If these were people that literally my only connection point to you, is the telephone that sits in the middle of the conference room table.
Well, that was the challenge that I had to learn over time. When I look back now and I reflect on myself as a leader then, I reflect on how bad I was and the mistakes I made. It was only over time that I really learned how to engage,
Yes.
how to make people feel like they're part of the team. And I did that by really looking at myself. Was I showing up as the authentic Darren? Was I the Darren that I wanted to be, or was I the Darren that I thought I should be?
Mm.
And over time, making mistakes, learning a little bit more about myself, being clearer on who I was able to gain trust of individuals. I was more engaging when I was with them. The time I spent was more powerful because of the investment that I was making into the relationship.
Mm.
And it can only be about the relationship and the quality of the time that you spend with the individual. That's how you build the trust, you get to know somebody.
Yeah, and I think this is a key thing for HR practitioners and leaders listening today to take away, right? Is you have to invest in relationship, and I think to do that in a meaningful way, but also in a way that is authentic to who you are. I can remember my experience of also leading a remote team. I'm not the most necessarily outgoing guy, not the life of the party at all, and I almost had to find my own style to say, as a leader, what is that going to look like for me? My preference was always smaller groups, to be able to really get to know people in a bit more on a personal level, as opposed to, these big 400, 500 people town halls of everybody that reports into
Mm.
you. So I'd love you to talk us through some of that. You spoke about communication and you spoke about checking in and following up. How did you apply that in some of your previous roles, and how did you do that so that your people also did not feel like you are micromanaging them? Because I can expect that also comes into play.
Well, in all honesty, Dieter, I guess at the beginning there was a little bit of micromanagement when you're
Mm.
setting the standard.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
fair.
and we came across, this sort of notion of wanting to be better, right?
Yeah.
And one of the solutions was to look hard at our communication. And as I say, this is where this mantra was kind of born. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't matter how big or how small the message you're giving. If you get these three things right, it makes a difference. So, for example, you could be take a big seminar, right? You've got your whole organization at a seminar for a
Yeah.
week. And on day one, you might have your most senior leaders standing on stage, sharing business strategy at its
Mm.
highest level, engaging with everybody, sharing all of the stuff that's going to happen in the future. And then, so that's your communicate part. The check understanding might be visiting the breakout rooms,
Mm.
working on the strategy. What's that going to look like, to me when we get back to our work locations? And then the follow-up piece is what's going on now? Now we're back in the workplace. How
Mm.
is the rubber hitting the road? What's landed? What have we done well? What do we need to course correct? What do we need to change? Um, that was a really important part of the conversation.
Mm. I also hear something that you're mentioning around consistency. And when I say consistency, there's this natural flow and rhythm that you got into with working with your teams, right? In terms of, and that's something when I chat to a lot of leaders leading remotely at the moment, where they say you have to find habits and rhythms that give people predictability and consistency. Um, you have the same experience when you were working with your teams, and how did that play out?
Yeah, sure. And to your question about micromanagement, right? When I think about early days, it was the call that I was talking about on that phone where nobody could see each other, and, right? And after the communicate piece, after the meeting, I would then have the opportunity to call my guys individually. That role I had back in the day, I spent a lot of time in the car traveling from location to location.
Yes.
So on the way, I would call each individual and say, any questions from the meeting this morning?
Yeah.
And then I would then put a little reminder in my calendar, for example, for the end of the week. And I would, message the guys again and say, hey, how are we getting on with X action
Yes.
that we agreed to do in our team meeting? So at the beginning, it was very much that micromanagement, and that was the routine that you're talking about. But over time, we got used to it. It didn't take long. It wasn't long before I had, I didn't have to send those messages. I didn't have to
Yes.
make those follow-up phone calls because we got into a good rhythm.
And I think there's also this component for me around that it almost sets the tone for certain principles in the team, right? Whenever you speak to somebody either working in leadership like yourself or somebody that has led a team, they will tell you, I have non-negotiable roles of how I lead a team, or I've got, things that are important to me to make sure that we are a fully functional team, and this is what we've agreed as part of that. And I think this almost needs to filter into setting that expectation between what do you want from me as a leader, even though you might not see me that frequently, and what do I expect of you, and then also the other way around, right? In terms of, expectations goes both ways. I can imagine you've got a few examples and horror stories of lessons that you've learned where things didn't quite go according to plan. Would you mind sharing some of those with us, especially in this remote context?
Yes, oh my goodness, I have some of those thoughts that come to mind. I think first, before I share, I really do think it's about what the team wants. I'm a huge believer in consensus. I'm a huge believer in consultation. I'm a huge believer in us signing up to what we want to be famous for. When people think about us as a team, what do we want people to say? So that was always a key part. It wasn't just about my version of how we should communicate. It was, what do we sign up for as a team? When I think about the horror stories, one that really comes to mind is mentioned in 2003, regional
Yes.
manager starting to go out and visit stores. And what I didn't know back then was one of the most important things about remote leadership, along with how you communicate, is how you leave people. Because you might not see them again for some time. And in my job, sometimes that could be weeks or maybe even months if it was Russia
Yes.
or one of the
Yes.
more, locations a bit further away and a bit harder to get to. So I would visit one of my stores, have a conversation, and then unbeknown to me, the managers in my team were getting on the phone and phoning the next one and saying, he's just left me, he's on his way. And
It's
he's
almost hide what you're doing. He's coming down, right? It's
right.
almost that type of sense.
And he's in a really bad mood today. And I may have been, or I may not have been, but what I didn't know at that time was the importance of how to leave people. So, I had this really old process that seems so out of date now of walking around. I'm sure some people in that world still do this, but walking around the store with the manager, critiquing everything and basically pointing out everything that was wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And then leaving them, like, bye, see you next time. I hope you get that stuff done before I see you.
and watch out, you will get the call. I will be on my way.
Right. And then that's when someone's, perceiving that as me being in a bad mood, and for me, I was just doing my job. I'm here to make sure that this is how it should go. And when I reflect back now and I think about Darren as a leader then and Darren as a leader now, it's poles apart. It's so different. And I practice catching people doing things right. Not critiquing people and catching them, what they've done wrong. So
Yeah.
I've learned so much over the years, and it is a huge journey.
Yeah. I think there's also this point there that you make around, I think leading, whether that's leading in general, but I think especially leading in a remote context, the style that you have to adopt is a lot more empowering, right? You almost have to. And I think that's something that leaders are struggling with at the moment, because I think, unfortunately, leadership and some of the older models have been associated a lot with control and with oversight and with power. And I think the way that we are seeing the world of work evolve at the moment is that leadership is actually much more defined by empathizing, empowering people to be able to do what they do, and helping them and rolling. I've always thought the best definition of leadership is you leave something better than what you found it. And the biggest job of a leader is to create runway and roll stumbling blocks out of the way for their particular team. How do I let go as a leader? What advice would you give to me if I'm a young leader, and especially if I'm used to managing people that I see every single day, and all of a sudden in this world I have to shift, and this is what I get. I see you on a screen as 5 days a week.
I guess it comes down to confidence in oneself and how well you know yourself. The fear of letting go, the fear of not controlling that situation, the fear of what might happen if you trust. I think one of the sort of penny drop moments for me, if you like, was this notion of catching people doing things right. I remember as a parent, for example, screaming at my kids, "Tidy your room! It's disgraceful," and getting absolutely nowhere. And then one day I remember going to my daughter's bedroom and it was immaculate. And I called her and I was like, come to your room, come with me. Look, she's like, what have I done? I said, this is amazing. This is fantastic. Your room is brilliant. I love this. And then I realized that I wasn't critiquing. I was reinforcing the right behavior. And I realized that doesn't only work with children or pets.
Yes.
It works with people. Who doesn't like to be told that they've done something really well? And there's no better way, right, to learn together, to contract together, if you like, around what we're going to do as a team. So I think that was a big unlock for me, and it made a big difference in how I learned to trust. Yes. Because I still over time, I guess I was still setting the standard of which, as a leader, I'm responsible for, but I was choosing to do it in a much more proactive way. I was purposefully looking, right, yes, for things to, to recognize, and it was much more engaging for my teams. Does that make sense, Dieter?
That makes a lot of sense. There is a very big movement that happened a couple of years ago around also being able to spot the positive in any situation, and particularly with regards to work, being able to say, but what are people doing well and how do we build upon that, as opposed to, unfortunately, I think some of the older styles tended to be a lot more focused on, I will make sure that you do not do anything wrong. So I think it's quite a big unlocking moment. The second thing, Darren, that you mentioned that I find very interesting is you're almost talking about the shift from reward and recognition and praise a lot more towards appreciation and affirmation, which I think is a very healthy thing in a leader's journey to be able to do. That thing around, how do I really notice people? How do I make sure I see you? And there's a very strong African concept that talks about the fact that I see you as a human being before I see you as the employee or where I find myself or whatever context I know you in. And if I'm able to do that, it boils down to some of the values regarding dignity and respect, because I think that again gets to our earlier point of relationship building. If that relationship and that trust is not in place, then I actually don't quite have a place to be able to engage with you in a fruitful and in a meaningful way. And I think that's something that remote leaders need to learn, right? How am I going to build that relationship, but how do I still stay authentically true to who I am and what I do, and how do I treat people with dignity and respect, and how do I affirm and appreciate. I used to play a game with my remote team, and I'd love your view on it, where I said at the end of the week, and they hated me for it at the beginning, and then later on I found out they started playing it when I was not in the room. But they played a game called Glad Sad. And all that the game was is I said, give me 3 things this week that really made you either glad or proud. And give me 1 thing this week that actually, you thought about and said, I'm quite sad about that. That didn't quite go according to plan. And we literally got into that routine and into that habit. And it gave us just this personal touch and connection. And you could bring anything to the table. You could share anything around either personal or work life. But I'd love to get your take on that, because I think leading remotely in a strange way does become a lot more personal and connected if you do it in the right way.
I think there's one word I'd like to pick out of what you said there, Dieter, that means a lot to me every single day, and that's values. And I think as a leader, if you can get in touch with your values, get clear on your values, and then the connected behaviors, I think that's a really important part of building the relationship that you're talking about with your teams. And then in turn, having them understand their values and the connected behaviors, and sharing that as a leader, sharing your values, being vulnerable. It's a word that gets used a lot now around leadership, but it's actually just about being a little bit more open and a bit more honest. My value is X, and as a result of that, sometimes I behave in this way. Sharing your values gives people clues as to why you do what you do sometimes. And I think if you can do that together as a team, share those values, share what matters to you, like I said, understand those connected behaviors, I think you go a long way to building those relationships. And then people start to open up, people start to talk more, and your game, which was, preempting that conversation around sharing what's important to me today, it's kind of a similar way of starting to communicate values, because values come through in what matters to you. I ask my teams to spend a ton of time on this, the values that I have as an individual.
Yes.
But also the values that you have as an individual, and then collectively the values that we sign up for as a team. Because when teams come together, they come together to talk about operational things.
Yes.
Yeah, how is business? How are we doing? Are we on track for this? They come together to talk strategy and talk about, okay, here's next month, next year. But teams never come together to say, how are we doing against the behaviors, the values that we agreed to? How are you doing today, Dieter? Nothing else. How are you doing? That's the difference between a team and high-performing teams. And if you can get that culture in remote teams, then it makes life a hell of a lot easier. And if I may, just continue in the conversation.
Please, go for it.
Right at the beginning of the call, we mentioned how COVID in the last 24 months has made, us mini leaders transition to this remote leadership place. And actually, I think that's also been somewhat connected to the Great Resignation that's been happening. And again, you touched earlier. I think that leaders with their teams with them in head office environments have got away with giving a substandard employee experience for a long time. And why? Because they've had this head office environment around them, propping them up. They've got this incredible, inspiring location, Amsterdam, London, New York, with rooftop terraces and fabulous canteens, and food offerings, with brand heat surrounding you with images and videos. I mean, certainly with Nike and Peloton, that stuff was everywhere. And Anita Roddick at Body Shop walking around the office, dropping inspirational moments with people because that was where she liked to be, interacting with her teams. And then social things, going to the pub after
Yes.
work, having lunch together, or these town hall meetings where the leaders stand up and give these inspirational messages. Well, in COVID times, when we all got sent home that day,
Yes.
suddenly everything was stripped back.
Mm.
All of the stuff that was propping up those leaders was just gone overnight. And people
Yeah.
started to realize that actually the leader that I have is, I'm actually putting up with things
Yes.
because of all of those other great experiences that make it okay. They offset it.
Mm.
And actually it held a mirror up to leaders. And the employees didn't like what they saw.
Yeah.
And as a result, people decided to choose differently.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's my personal opinion is that's what's behind a lot of the great resignation that we talk about now. People have seen the situation they're in, all of the good stuff, the fun stuff's been taken away, and it's
Yes.
really coming down to the relationship, and often the relationship they have with their boss, and they're like, I don't like this. This
Yeah.
isn't what I want anymore.
I think you're spot on in your assessment of that. There's various research studies that tells us your engagement at work is 80% due to the relationship that you have of trust and consistency and fairness with your direct leader or manager, because they do play a gatekeeper type of role. I think where you are correct is it almost feels to me a bit, and I think that's going to be important for leaders to think about going forward beyond the pandemic era that we still find ourselves in, is who are you as a leader when I strip away all the gimmicky stuff that sits around and props you up in some of these environments? Because you're right. I think also I've definitely seen a shift in some of our clients I work with around what boardroom dynamics look like at the moment. Because I think, I can remember I got called into some of the organizations I worked in. You got called into Exco. Would dress up really, really nicely that day, would go in and you feel the power and the authority, sitting there. And that immediately, on the one end, inspires you to be better, but on the other end, it also sets the tone for what is that engagement and that interaction going to look like. Where
Right.
now I'm very dependent on, it's the two of us in the room, or it's 15 faces on the screen, or even still in some industries, it's still people just on the other side of a phone call. And then I think it really does boil down to, but who are you as a leader, and how are you connected to that particular team?
Mhm.
Then I want to move the conversation along a little bit, because I think very often we talk a lot about the challenges of leading remotely, and I think we've kind of covered quite a few of those.
Mhm.
There's also some opportunity, and there's also a lot of benefits of being able to lead in this new world. And I'd love to get your view on, as a leader, what can I look forward to? I think at the moment we are still very much in this crisis adapting mode, but what can I look forward to going forward to be a leader in the way that the world will work going forward?
I think that as a leader, it's the opportunity to really become the leader that you want to be
Mm.
with everything stripped back. And it kind of is if people are working from home, right?
Yeah.
You don't have some of those aids that we were talking about. And I really think that there's the opportunity to grow oneself, to ask for feedback, to
Mm.
invest in opportunities to self-develop. Take a coach, for example, as a fantastic way to get help. But to be open and have that journey into self,
Mm.
that discovery is a great opportunity. And then ask how you're doing.
Mm.
Ask for feedback. Ask your team. That those 3 times teams come together that I spoke about. For the first time, operationally, yes. The second time, strategically, yes. The third time, just to check in.
Yes.
How are we doing? If leaders embrace that opportunity and they'll take their team to that next level, the trust they build, the relationships they build, how they interact with each other, the honesty that they have, the creativity that brings, that co-creation and
Mm.
partnership. um, confronting your fears by
Mm.
being honest and open and saying, I don't, I'm not good in this space, but I know you are. So please, would you help me? Um, and then you get into this next level of being brave and honest and saying, you know what, Dieter, I really got that wrong earlier, and I'm sorry, that wasn't my
Mm.
intention. Or Dieter, thank you for that work you did. It was incredible. That piece that you gave to me for our meeting with X really did hit the mark.
Mm.
So I think the emotional leader
Yes.
is where there's a huge opportunity. And I think the emotional leader is an inspirational leader. I
Mm.
think that
I like that.
authentic leader, purposeful in how you interact with people. And I think an inspirational leader, it trumps
Yeah.
office parties, it trumps barbecues, it trumps, right?
I hear you
Artwork and brand heat. Because, yeah, if, yeah, you get
no
where I'm going.
completely. I think there is this notion also around, I think, the opportunity for leaders going forward, and I think you've said it extremely well. There is, I need to do some self-reflection first on who am I as a leader. I think that's the starting point. I think we've got the opportunity to reshape what the world believes good leaders look like, because I think something that the pandemic has taught us is that there's other leadership qualities as opposed to just delivering performance and, being the person that's seen as cutthroat. I actually think it has taught us a lot more, like you've mentioned, around empathetic leadership, or about situational leadership that's able to really deep dive into, but who's the human in this moment, and where do I need to meet them. I think the other interesting shift that we will see is, I think, for leaders to be really successful in the future world and from a remote point of view, I think employees are also going to have to behave in a different way. I sometimes feel for leaders where I think over time we've almost heroed the leadership role so much that it's basically impossible for a leader to be successful. They are set up for failure right from the get go when they get that title. You are now leader of X, or you are the leader of the team. I think we need to get back to some real conversations to say, as a leader, I'm also just human. These are the things that are important to me. You mentioned the values component earlier. These are the things where even myself, I can be vulnerable, that I struggle with. And these are the things where I really would love you to help me as part of that. And I think if we can start almost getting into that collective leadership with the team style, where we really care for each other in that way. Yes, we've
Mm-hmm.
got goals to deliver. Yes, we've got to perform. But I think there's an opportunity here to really start thinking about, how do we do that? And for some personality types, doing it online is actually easier, which some of the research is starting to tell us as well, which has opened up a lot of doors for people that might, with face-to-face contact, not necessarily always thrive in that moment and in that situation. And for others, it's going to be more difficult. And I think it is to find that balance around making sure that people have what they need, but you know what is expected of you, and being able to take that forward. Darren,
Mm.
who's doing this well? You work with, and we don't need to talk names, obviously, but when you look around the world, the leaders that you admire at the moment, what are they doing well?
I kind of feel like I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but I really do think it comes down to
Mm.
those core behaviors, and it is about simplifying. Nike used to talk about simplify and go,
Yeah.
um, and I really do think that we can overcomplicate what
Yes.
leadership is,
Yes.
and also don't forget, a leader is also an employee.
Mm.
A leader also has the privilege, that's not the right word, has the right to
Mm.
an incredible employee experience.
Mm.
And if the leader is not set up for success, or if the leader's boss,
Yes.
right, um, is not responding to them in the same way, is not willing to get on this journey of trust and openness and evolving the relationship, then that's when the leader role becomes terribly lonely. And you're the person that has to have all the answers all of the time. And you rarely get told, well done, you did great stuff. All the things that you're supposed to do as a leader rarely happen to you when you are the leader, unless you're very fortunate someone is doing that for you. I think the people that are doing things really well are those that are really investing in employee experience.
Mm.
And I think employee experience is changing over time. I think
Agree.
about Nike. At one point, I had a very large team, and there was thousands of people in an employee survey, thousands.
Mm.
And when the report came back, pay was nowhere to be seen
Mm.
in those, quantifiable benefits of working for Nike.
Yes.
My development, my growth, my engagement, my sense of belonging,
Mm.
being part of a team, my progression, the experiences I have at work. That's the stuff that was at the top, and then somewhere down was pay.
Mm.
And I'm a firm believer that the experiences can be presented to you, packaged up nicely in the shape of an event or a giveaway or an
Yes.
office or a free lunch or whatever. But it can also be given to you packaged up in the shape of teamwork,
Yes.
cohesion, compassion, consensus,
Yeah.
leadership. And I think that that's the people that are getting it right.
Mm.
And I know Nike worked really hard at that good stuff. And I personally thank Nike for that,
Mm.
because I learned a lot over time. I think back to way back, and Anita Roddick. Anita always said, "Focus on the behaviors, and the results will come."
Mm.
And it took me quite some time to figure that out.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely true. Focus on the behaviors, and the results will come. And I
Mm.
think the people that are focusing on the behaviors, what is it that we're here for? What are we trying to achieve? Are we in this together? Does everybody understand their role?
Yes.
Right? Those are the people that are doing well. The people that are obsessing the numbers day in, day out, all they're doing is chasing a number, and then that pressure just flows right down through the organization. And
Mm.
I'm not sitting here in my ivory tower espousing these theories, for any other reason than I've learned on the way,
Yes.
because I've been the guy that's phoning people and saying, "What happened yesterday?" Right? But
No, I think it's such good learnings. Definitely also on the side of, you mentioned a couple of really valuable things that I just want to call out before we start wrapping up. Is the first one is, you have to create that sense of belonging for people to feel part of something. I think
mhm,
leadership in the future is going to be around what is the inspirational story that you really get people to want to belong to. Once they are there, how do you keep them included? I think we are seeing a lot of reports at the moment around proximity bias being a real thing, where leaders are starting to realize, when I lead in a hybrid world, there's actually some other factors that I also need to account for in terms of who I engage with and who is accessible, and how do I, make sure that everybody still has a voice and feels trusted with regards to that. I think that is such an interesting notion that's also shifting. I think you also mentioned the fact that, the hygiene factors we need to get right. I think that is a given, but the real experience lies in almost more the transformative factors. It's almost those factors that, you know, what is your style as a leader? Can I trust the leader? What is the experience I provide to my employees? Do I really, really care for them? Do I also invest in them in terms of the leaders that they will become? One of my mentors always made the comment to say, the real test is how many people did you grow to be leaders after you've left. And I
mhm.
think, that type of legacy is something that we need to help our leaders with as well.
Or how many people enjoyed coming to work when you were their leader?
Yeah, it's a great
Right?
question. It's a great question.
Enjoying coming to work. Every employee, wherever they are, deserves to have an incredible employee experience. Everybody,
Mm,
because your employee experience impacts on your well-being, it impacts
mm,
on your family life, how you are at home. Nobody comes to work and deserves to be treated badly.
mm,
No one comes to work to be invisible and not heard.
mm,
Nobody comes to work to not feel good about what they're doing and that they're contributing to something. Everybody deserves that stuff. And if you're unable to provide that, then you need to look really hard at why. Because it's not that hard. It's not that
Yeah.
hard to ask someone how they're doing.
Yes.
And then not just ask them, but be interested in the answer. To say thank you, to say I got that wrong. This is human behavior at the core of good, healthy relationships. And as a leader, it's not that hard to invest in oneself, to practice and train and work and be really good at that.
I like that, and I think that it's almost a theme for me a bit, Darren, about what we've spoken about today is, strip away the stuff that we've celebrated in the past and let's get back to the core of what leadership really is. And leadership is about bringing people along a particular journey in a responsible way, in a way that you can actually build followership. And I think that's going to be important for leaders in the future as part of that as well. Darren,
Sure.
from my side, I've definitely learned a lot from you, and thank you for your insights today as well. Where can some of our listeners get hold of you? Where can they reach out to you?
I have on LinkedIn. They can look me up for sure. And let's keep it simple. LinkedIn.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Darren, thank you so much for your time. Definitely taken a lot out of this conversation. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dieter. It's been a pleasure. And I hope to talk soon.